valued member of our local community. Rogers TV is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. For more information, please visit our website.
Welcome to Resilience Rising, the podcast that shatters poverty myths, sparks optimism, and fuels innovative change through community-inspired discussions. The title of today's episode is Cracks in the Local Housing Crisis. It's horrible, but not hopeless. I'm Amanda Fellows, Community Programs Manager at CFS Counseling and Wellbeing.
And I'm Brian Shelley, the Chief Executive and Philanthropy Officer at United Way Simcoe Muskoka. We've all heard about the housing crisis, but we need to understand that it is more complex than just high prices and lack of inventory. We want to understand what caused the crisis and what can we do to end it. What will the long-term impacts be? These questions and more is what we'll be talking about today on Resilience Rising.
On behalf of Brian and myself, I'm honored to acknowledge that we are currently recording on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. CFS Counseling and Wellbeing and United Way Simcoe Muskoka respect Indigenous history and culture and are dedicated to moving forward in the process of reconciliation with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people.
And today we're joined in the studio by Jennifer Van Gennep. Thank you for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe to start with, if you could explain who you are, what organization you represent, and the scope of your role there.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Communications and Advocacy at Redwood Park Communities. I've been with Redwood since it started, with Tim and Rhonda since it started. So we're celebrating our 15th year this year. It's our 15-year anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So our mission there is to create safe, affordable, hopeful housing where people thrive in community. So it's the housing part is really important, but also that community piece, making sure that both are in place. Through Redwood, I've also become very involved in local advocacy. So I'm the past chair of the Simcoe County Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm a founding member of the Barrie Housing and Homeless Justice Network. And currently I'm the co-chair of the Ontario Alliance to End Homelessness.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I really love that language around safe, affordable, and hopeful housing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we talk a lot about everyone has a right to safe housing and affordable housing, but it is such a challenging conversation, and I really have always loved how Redwood uses the term hopeful in there as well, because we have to have hope.
Exactly.
If we don't have hope for a better tomorrow, then why are we in the business that any of us are doing? So I want to commend you on that branding. I like that branding of using that term hopeful, because I think it's important. We have to have hope.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed it in the title of today's episode too. I agree. Without hope, it's one of our core values, and it's what keeps us going a lot of days, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's kind of this resounding heaviness around housing and this piece that it is a hopeless scenario. What do you think some of the root causes are contributing to the housing crisis? I know that probably feels like a really loaded question. And how do those factors kind of intersect with poverty?
Yeah, so I would say it is largely a poverty issue, if I'm being honest. So we're all being affected by the housing. I actually don't like using the word housing crisis. I just
What do you use?
We're in a situation. I just feel like we've got an issue with housing. I would say it's the commodification of housing. So this idea where your house is where you're building your wealth, right? And it's becoming more and more a wealth building tool. We have more and more people owning more than one house. And if you're statistically right now, if you own two houses, you're really likely to own 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more, right? So it's this idea of housing is a faster way to build wealth than buying stocks or putting it under your mattress or whatever, right? Or even than working a job in a lot of cases, right? And so that has just put so much pressure on what's supposed to be a human right. So when housing the way some people view housing, I don't even feel like we should use the term housing because it is an investment vehicle. And when you talk about housing, it should be, where people live.
Right.
So between February in 2020 and February 2022, housing prices in Barrie, according to BDAR, went up 86%.
Wow.
And then, of course, that's not even including was it 9 or 10 interest rate increases through 2022, 2023. So housing prices are wild right now. We've never seen anything like this for housing prices, and we're all feeling it. But if you were on Ontario Works or ODSP, or disability benefits, if you were relying on the government for social assistance, or even if you're working a minimum wage job, it just isn't enough anymore, right? So most of the people that are, for a lack of better visual, but kind of falling out of the bottom of the housing market, those are people who were in the lowest income bracket. They were the most vulnerable when the prices went up, of course, as always. And if it's like housing musical chairs, when the music stopped, it's the people who are most vulnerable. And in this case, it's the people who have the least money and or the least connections, right? I'd like to think that I probably won't ever be homeless myself, but it's only because I have a really strong support network. Yeah. My mom isn't going to let me, I have options like that. And it's not about, moral anything around me or deserving it. It's around being really fortunate to have a good support network that's going to keep me out of homelessness personally.
So we're having this conversation right now in Barrie, which is in Simcoe County, part of the larger Simcoe-Muskoka region. You and I think you hit on something there that's important for us to recognize. Yes, this is a national challenge. We use the term crisis. And frankly, it's more than national. We know that there's similar challenges south of the border as well. But, I would venture to guess that 86% increase that we've seen in Barrie specifically, and we know what Barrie is the largest urban center within the Simcoe County, Simcoe-Muskoka region. It kind of is, it then spreads across the entire region. That 86% increase can't be consistent, I'm imagining, with the province or the cross country.
It's in pockets, I think.
Yeah.
I think
so. We would be one of those pockets most hit.
We are in a pocket.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's why, again, with the wonder of a podcast, this can be heard by anyone all across the world. We hope that lots of people are hearing it. But if we look specifically at the communities that we're talking about, we are living in a pocket. We are living in a community that has really been hit by this housing challenge or housing reality.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such an important topic today to discuss.
Yeah. Yep.
So despite the challenges, are there any promising strategies or initiatives being implemented locally to address housing insecurity that you want to highlight? And they can be ones that have been championed by your organization or in partnership with others.
Sure. So, yes, I think so. There are also lots of things happening that feel well-intentioned, but probably aren't the thing. I'm seeing a shift towards trying to make better encampments rather than people moving out of encampments. You know what I mean? Even from surprising.
And that's interesting, right? Because, there is this shift that actually I support of providing dignity to folks living in encampments, right? This is someone's home or this is someone's shelter. But our objective shouldn't be, while you can work with folks living rough with dignity, we shouldn't be looking at that as the solution, right?
No.
We still want to be moving people towards or supporting folks to be able to move towards safe, hopeful housing.
Yeah. So I think maybe something that sometimes gets lost in translation in the media and things is people that are living in tents. When I go talk to people that live in tents, all of them want housing.
Right.
They don't want to move into a shelter. And there are lots of reasons that have nothing to do, no shade to our shelters. Obviously, they provide a really important service.
Hashtag no shade to our shelters.
And also, if you can't stay with your partner,
sure,
or if you can't
Or
you
don't
can't
feel
bring
safe.
your pet with you, or you don't feel safe because of the actual situation not being safe, maybe because of your anxiety, you don't want to be, there's 100 reasons.
Or the relationships you have with other folks staying within that shelter, right?
Yep, absolutely.
There are neighbors of mine that I wouldn't want to share a roof with necessarily, right?
Absolutely.
So I can totally understand that.
So there's lots of completely valid reasons to not want to go into a shelter and to choose, especially the way some of the shelter, like sometimes you have a spot in a shelter for you, but sometimes it's on a nightly basis. So you're going to give up and you can only bring in one bag with you. So you're going to give up all your possessions, your tent and everything for tonight's bed, but maybe you won't have a bed the next night. So lots of reasons to not want to go into a shelter, but pretty much everyone that I have spoken to in encampments, and my colleagues that work frontline and talk to a lot more people than I do in encampments will say the same thing. Pretty much everybody wants housing.
Yeah.
And that looks different for different people. Also, just because you don't want an apartment in an apartment building doesn't mean you don't want housing. I feel like this is maybe where tiny homes come in, a little bit more autonomy, maybe even as a transition step. But I think we need to be offering lots of options for people in tents, and it should be, we need a housing first approach to tents, in my opinion. We need to be able to offer housing. The concept of housing first, have you talked about housing first already here?
No.
Okay, so the idea is you don't have to get your stuff together in order to qualify for housing. You are given housing because you are a human, and that is your right. And then housing is such an incredible stabilizer that some things just fall in place almost immediately.
Once you're no longer we're thinking about survival.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And then the other pieces, you're at least in a more stable place to be able to start working on those other pieces. And then you can set your own goals, and then your caseworker or whoever can help you meet those goals. They might be around your health. Sometimes, like when we have people move into Lucy's Place. So Lucy's Place is for people who have experienced chronic homelessness here in Barrie. People who move in there have often, especially the first group of people that moved in, had been outside for 6, 10, 15 years, right? And so they come in and they get settled, and then they start thinking like, oh, actually, maybe I should get my liver checked.
Right.
Or, it might be great to reconnect with my aunt or my brother, or those kinds of things start to fall in place once you have housing. But if you don't have housing and you don't know where lunch is coming from, like your whole mindset shifts. I know we all have kids. Do you remember how sleep deprived you were and how it changed how you even thought?
I mean, I don't because I don't even remember it, right? Yes. Yeah. No.
Blocked it out.
Right? I blocked it out. I have 3 kids. It's a long time ago now. My son is 17 and the girls are 15. So I actually had 3 kids in 2 years. And I remember almost like floating over my body, looking at my kids and screaming watching myself yell at my family and being like, just stop, just say your story, say you're sorry, and just stop talking right now. But your brain just is working completely differently.
Yeah.
And then we have this idea that when people come into shelter, they have to ask politely. Right. Or they have to, or when you go to the food bank, any of these services that you have to go in and ask politely and be really, have it together. Even just my own experience, and I was in a very supported environment. I just had a lot of kids and I hadn't slept in a long time. But I know when I put myself in that position, you take away my phone, my car, my credit card, and I'm supposed to just be in survival mode. In a matter of days, if not hours, I will be like a different person in survival mode.
Right.
And so I think it can happen to anyone. And I just think when we see people outside or people in a tent or people getting grumpy or, they're just in survival mode. And I just think it's important to remember that could be any of us. And I would probably react even worse. I don't think I have those kinds of survival skills personally. So
It's true. I mean, we had Kelly Jones from the YWCA on the first episode talking about getting ahead and bridges out of poverty. And she speaks to that a lot about the concept of the tyranny of the moment, right? And, when we expect, people who are living in poverty to get a job or, do whatever, but they're in the constant state of solving crisis, right? And so providing housing, right, as a right helps people to then navigate exactly what you're saying, some of those bigger picture pieces, because they're not constantly wondering where they're going to sleep the next night.
Yeah.
Right. Or whether they'll have the stuff that they own, or whether they have to,
Absolutely. And we hear so many people say, like, why don't they just get a job or something like that? If somebody comes and clears away your tent, we see regularly people who lose their ID.
Yeah.
People, then they don't have a birth certificate. So in our rapid rehousing program, just recently, we helped a woman who had no ID. She was adopted, so she didn't have a copy of her birth certificate. So because she'd never had a birth certificate, she couldn't get ID, so she couldn't get a license. She couldn't open a bank account. She could never rent anything. Getting that ID opened so many doors to her that people take for granted, right? You can't get a job. You can't do anything if you don't have photo ID. And so once she was able to get that, and that's actually one of the things that in our rapid rehousing program that we've had to do for almost everybody that comes into it, is you start with ID, and that takes 30 to 60 days.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, depending on if you have your birth certificate to start with, like if you have to go back and get a copy of your birth certificate and then take that to get your ID, there's just a lot of pieces that sometimes people take for granted that go into actually being we say everybody's housing ready, but document ready is actually like a thing. You have to be able to have your documents in order.
It's more everyone's worthy of being housed.
Absolutely.
We've just set up systems that prevent them from being truly housing ready practically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do we do? Because really, let's get back to the hopeful side.
Back to the hope, yeah.
So,
I know.
when we think about local governments, housing authorities, community organizations, what can they do to make housing more affordable, more accessible for low-income humans?
All right. So on my way here, I drove by the Bobcat place on Dunlop, and they have a sign outside that says, "Moving mountains one shovel at a time, one scoop at a time." We're moving mountains one scoop at a time. So I do think that's actually fits into this conversation is we're doing it one scoop at a time, and we all have a role. None of us has to do all of it, but we all have a role. So from the government, I'd love to see investments in nonprofit housing. And I'm not just saying that because I work at a housing nonprofit organization. Mine's much sharper than mine, have said this is what we need to get out of this situation is housing that is for nonprofits. And when we look at other countries, is it called OECD countries? Whatever, like our comparator countries, whatever it is, our percentage of nonprofit housing is around 4%. And most of the other countries that we compare in other categories are in twice that or into double digits. So we just don't have enough nonprofit housing to meet the needs of the folks who aren't going to find market housing. At the provincial level, I think, so a lot of that will come federally, also some provincially. At the provincial level, we keep talking about supply, and I don't think we're talking about tenant protections enough. And when I bring up tenant protections, sometimes I'm like booed out of the room. So this is just the idea. There's a great book by Ricardo Tranjan called The Tenant Class that I highly recommend. And it's just like part of what has made people so precarious is this idea that if it's a rental property, it's an income property, right? So if you're living in it, I can only raise my rent $25. If I'm your landlord, I can only raise your rent $25 or $50 a year. There's a percentage. But if you leave, if I make it uncomfortable enough for you to leave, or I tighten up my rules so much that you're out, then I can change my rent to whatever I want. I can double the rent for the new guy because there's no protections in between tenants. Yeah. So then we lose affordable housing stock that way too. So if you lose your tenancy, society also loses an affordable housing unit because your unit is no longer affordable if your landlord raises the rent like they can. the landlord-tenant boards, from all accounts, seems to be completely broken. People just aren't getting a fair shake in there. I think you guys support, does just Catholic Family Services, you support some people in the like when they have their hearings. So hearings have moved online, which is great in some ways, but in some ways it's terrible. You can, your landlord tenant hearing can now be in a Zoom room, and you're supposed to log in and say you're there at 9:30, but your hearing could be anytime between 9:30 and 5. So if you're also at work that day and you have, however many minutes on your phone, or, whatever the situation is, we have people not being able to really represent themselves well in that system. And then, so I definitely think there's things the government could do. I also just read recently 2 things. I read that the provincial government is putting a lot more investments into shelters than they are into housing. And I do think we need to see that flipped. And
recognizing that shelters are the Band-Aid solution.
The Band-Aids, yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
It's the whole idea. I mean, if we talk about food security, food banks are a necessary service to address the challenge, but they don't solve food security.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And then income supports, like most people you see in a tent are on Ontario Works or on ODSP, right? So if we had more, if those were tied more to the actual costs of living, then we would see a lot less people who can't pay rent. 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I went to a conference called the Community Change Experience, and Tamarack was one of the groups putting it on. And it was a 3-day event about community change. And we didn't talk about policy advocacy until the last morning. And I was like, because that's my whole game, right? So that was a shift for me. And so we sat with community leaders and heard what they were doing. And we heard community leaders talk about, we're going to, if we get a mayor or somebody that's with us, then we can move faster down the football. He was using football analogies, so I'm going to mess them up. But he was like, we can go 10 yards or whatever, but we're not going to wait for a politician that wants the same things we do. We're going to move the ball ourselves 5 yards at a time. And then we'll go faster if somebody's with us, but we're not going to wait for somebody to come save us. And so I've been more and more interested in community power. And I like a communications, I call her a communications guru, but she talks a lot about talking about progressive ideas. And she says, the many can win over the money when we're organized. So just
love
this idea, right? So it's this idea of organizing, because actually there are more of us that want to see things change and that want to take care of each other. And if we get organized, then, we're kind of fighting against some, I don't even know how to say, like greed is probably one of the biggest reasons that we have homelessness, if I'm just going to name it. So, if we can get organized, community power. So one of the things that we're doing at Redwood is taking back a little bit of that community power. We have built multiple housing projects with government funding and even with capital campaigns and things like that, big grants and government funds. But we are doing a new thing. We're starting Redwood Community Housing Bonds. So this is tapping into that community power, community capital, actually. So actually the money probably exists in our community to do what we need to do. So very soon, not yet, but very soon we'll be launching Redwood Community Bonds. And then it's really, the idea is socially conscious investors, probably such as ourselves, can invest locally, and then you get not just a return, like the financial return, because there is interest paid, but you also get to see the social return right in our community. So
I love that model.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So we're excited about that.
want to go back because you started, the social interest bonds are super interesting as well. But we are this episode will drop in May, so just weeks after the federal budget was announced. And I'm wondering if you have, I'm sure we can do a full podcast on your thoughts on the housing initiatives in the federal budget. But I guess what's your take? As one of the leading voices on housing in our community, I was gonna end things by saying this is a get for us to have Jennifer here.
True.
Jennifer is is an authority on this topic, not just locally actually, but across the country.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on our federal government's proposed investments to address housing?
That's very kind. Thank you. I think there are some good, bold things in the federal budget. It's probably the best housing budget we've seen in a long, long time. Is it enough? Probably not. It's a really good start. It's a really good step in the right direction, I think.
What are some of the things in it that you like?
I love the acquisitions. What was it called? Acquisitions Fund. So groups like Redwood or anybody will be able to, not anybody, but organizations, nonprofit organizations will be able to buy housing that's coming up that might get sold off to a for-profit investor type thing and buy it an apartment building or whatever, right? So that it stays affordable. That's going to be really important. There's more Rapid Housing Initiative money, RHI, and we've seen a few rounds of that, and it's been pretty effective in getting new housing built. So there's the acquisition to keep housing, affordable housing, some more rapid housing money to build more rentals, affordable rentals, which is what we need. We do need that. There's some tenant protection stuff in there. The federal government is, I would say, limited in what they can do around tenant protection. So I think, does it go far enough? No, but we have to remember jurisdiction as well. And
it's provincial.
Yeah. It's a very provincial layer. I think there was more reaching home money too. Yeah. More reaching home money, which is good.
And for those that don't know, Reaching Home
thank you.
is the federal government's investment into communities to address housing and homelessness through the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah. So those are all
United
good.
Way administers in rural and remote communities across Simcoe, Muskoka, and the province of Ontario.
Yes, you do. So those are all good steps. And I actually they've done a few things where the provinces have to do something to get money. So that's more outcomes based. It's not just here's a bunch of money, do what you want. We know you have a problem. Do as you see fit. There's a lot of money there that's tied both for the provinces and for municipalities, if I'm remembering correctly, that if you do this, you will get this money. And I think we do need a little bit of that. I think we're at that point. Yeah.
In an effort to, I think it's important that also this podcast is completely nonpartisan. So what are you critical of in this federal budget?
Yeah, it just doesn't go far enough.
Not far enough.
It doesn't go far enough.
And I think that's the part that I would say, there's been a lot of trumpeting of that this is the greatest investment ever in housing. And it's easy to get swept up in that, but not lose sight of the fact that it isn't enough.
No.
It's, I think the term I used recently was, it's a good first step.
Yeah.
But it's just a first step.
But it's a step in the right direction for sure. And I would say it's a step in the right direction. And some of it is, I don't know, have you read recently, there's some articles recently about the federal government made housing a right. But if the provinces don't pick it up, right, then it doesn't go as far. And even here in Barrie, we have a new affordable housing strategy, and it had 9 recommendations. And I was like, guys, can we make the 10th one recognize housing as a human right? And they're like, you're so funny, Jennifer. And I'm like, no, really, you'd rather put out 9 recommendations than put out 10 and have one of them be housing.
And frankly, that should be number 1.
Of course, because and they're like, well, it's mostly symbolic. I'm like, actually, no, it's not. If you treat housing as a human right, it affects your budget decisions. It affects how much you put into the community improvement plan for affordable housing investments in our city. It affects almost all the other recommendations. It affects when you have land. Like we have 4 parcels of land that are up right now, and they're trying to decide what to do with them, whether they should sell them for residential development. Your own affordable housing strategy says that you should work with a nonprofit and have it be affordable housing.
Yeah.
The one that you just
Put out.
a couple months ago says that should be the plan, and we're having this conversation now. I don't know. Were we supposed to get locally political, or?
That's okay.
It's okay. I mean, it's not a secret. We wrote a letter to City Council that said that.
Yeah.
You should use your public land for public good, and public good would be public housing right now.
Right.
Yeah. Don't sell it off, and then you have no control.
Yeah,
It's not just a stock issue.
Yeah, no, it's this shift that we need elected officials to stop looking at only quote unquote taxpayers, but look at residents. And your residents includes everyone.
Everyone that calls the city home.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what can people do? Right. So, I mean, you have your title is Director of Communication
Yes.
and Advocacy, but if I'm someone who's listening, outside of maybe, putting money into bonds, and seeing those pieces, what kind of advocacy work can folks from the community do?
Yeah. So if you know your ward counselors, if you know who your ward counselor is, if you know what ward you live in, or if you don't know what ward you live in, you can look it up on the website, find out who your counselor is. Of whatever municipality you're in. You can find out who your city councilor is or your town councilor, and you can let them know. You don't have to you don't have to know all the things to get involved in this conversation. You can just say, I think affordable housing is important. I'm more concerned about the safety of people living in tents than I am about safety from the people living in tents, right? I'm more nervous for them than I am of them, if that is true about you. You can say, I want to see you prioritize housing as a human right. You can just ask good questions too, even if you don't know the answers. You can say, so how are you working affordable housing into this budget? Even if you haven't seen the budget, you can just ask, where's affordable housing in this budget, or whatever it is, right? You can just ask questions and just let people know you're paying attention. You can also, you have an MPP. We all have an MPP, a member of provincial parliament that represents us in Queen's Park for provincial issues, and a member of parliament that represents us for federal issues. And you can learn who they are, and you can email them or leave them voicemails. Call after hours if you'd rather leave a voicemail. It's fine. But I think I feel like the loudest people maybe don't represent what most of us feel on this issue. I think we have maybe a vocal minority when it comes to this issue, and I think most of us want to take care of each other.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, so speak up.
Jen, if you could leave us with one thought, what would your one thought be?
No pressure.
No pressure. I mean, I don't know. I think this moving mountains one scoop at a time thing kind of stuck with me today.
Yeah.
And that's what jumps to my mind. I know it's a little cheesy, but sometimes I think we do have to keep a little bit of hope in it. So,
I mean, this is a longitudinal problem, right?
Yeah.
I think that, and maybe actually, using that analogy, it maybe gives me a little, maybe a cause to give a little bit more grace for our recent federal budget, and recognizing that the first step, you can't take your second step without your first step.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
And so I think whenever we see indicators from any level of government of trying to address this issue, whether it's as fast as we want it to be or not, we probably do need to applaud those efforts, because it's not going to happen without a first step, and this is a generational issue.
Yeah. Yes.
Jen, I wasn't speaking in hyperbole before. You are one of the leading voices and advocates around this issue of housing and homelessness, and I really want to thank you for joining us on this. Was our second episode of the Resilience Rising podcast, and what a great voice you were to bring to light some of these issues around housing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks also to our studio partners at Uplift Black Center for Social Justice and Inclusion. We recorded today's podcast at their Upbeat Box Creative Studio in downtown Barrie. And of course, To you, our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you like this episode, please subscribe and use social media to let others know about Resilience Rising, the podcast that shatters poverty myths, it sparks optimism, and fuels innovative change through community-inspired discussion. You can promote our podcast using the hashtag Resilience Rising.
And we'll see you next time on episode 3, which will be dropping soon when we discuss myth busting and inclusion, moving towards inclusive communities. I'm Amanda Fellows of CFS Counseling and Wellbeing.
And I'm Brian Shelley from United Way Simcoe Muskoka.
Asking you to embrace innovative change to ensure our communities are great places to live for everyone. Thanks for tuning in.